The Appalachian Trail is more than just a path through the wilderness, it's a world of its own. Stretching over 2,000 miles, it winds through 14 states, cutting across mountains, rivers, and deep, shadowy forests. For many, it's a place of escape, a sanctuary where the sounds of rushing creeks and rustling leaves drown out the chaos of everyday life. Hikers from all walks of life come here in search of solitude, adventure, and self-discovery. But there's another side to the trail, one that isn't talked about in travel guides, a side whispered among seasoned hikers around campfires, where they speak of the dangers that don't come from the elements, but from something or someone hidden in the trees. Most visitors believe they are alone in nature, but they're not. Along this vast, unguarded stretch of wilderness, strangers cross paths. Some are fellow hikers sharing meals and stories. Others are drifters, loners, people escaping something or hiding from something. And then there are the ones who watch from the shadows. In the summer of 1981, two young hikers set out on what was supposed to be the journey of a lifetime. They would never return. Robert Mountford Jr. and Susan Ramsey were both in their early 20s, intelligent, ambitious, and eager to make a difference in the world. They weren't just thrill seekers looking for adventure. They were volunteers for a program called the Trail Outreach Project, traveling the Appalachian Trail to assist hikers in need, offering guidance, and spreading awareness about resources for those who found themselves in trouble along the way. Robert, a dedicated social worker from Virginia, had a quiet strength about him. He was the kind of person who saw the good in others, always willing to help. Susan, a nurse from Maine, shared that same compassion. She had a warm, gentle energy, the type of person you'd trust instantly. Together, they made the perfect team, two kind-hearted souls, trekking through the wilderness with the hope of making the world just a little bit better. They planned their journey carefully, mapping out their stops along the trail, checking in with their organization whenever they could. They carried minimal supplies, relying on the kindness of fellow hikers and shelters along the way. For the first few weeks, everything went according to plan. They met friendly hikers, took in breathtaking views, and documented their journey in notes and letters sent back home. But somewhere along the trail, that sense of peace began to shift. A stranger had been watching them. Someone who wasn't there for the fresh air, the challenge, or the adventure. Someone who had something else in mind. The Appalachian Trail is a place of fleeting connections. Hikers cross paths, share stories, and then disappear into the trees, continuing their journey. Some are never seen again. In the days leading up to the attack, multiple hikers reported seeing an unusual figure near the shelters along the trail. A man who didn't seem to belong. He wasn't carrying much, no heavy backpack, no proper hiking gear. He lingered near campsites, watching from a distance but rarely engaging. Those who did speak to him described him as off, his mannerisms strange, his responses short, almost rehearsed. Some thought he was just another drifter passing through. Others felt an unease they couldn't quite explain. Randall Lee Smith had been lurking in the woods. It's unclear when he first set his sights on Robert Mountford and Susan Ramsey. Perhaps he saw their kindness as weakness. Maybe he resented them for reasons only he knew. But what is certain is that he followed them. Somewhere along the trail, Robert and Susan became targets. They had no way of knowing they were being watched. No way of knowing that each step they took led them closer to something unspeakable. The exact moment they met Randall Lee Smith remains a mystery. No living witness can say for sure how their paths crossed, but somewhere in the dense Virginia woods, far from civilization, they encountered the man who would end their lives. Did he approach them with a smile? Did he offer conversation, pretending to be another traveler seeking companionship on the lonely trail? Or was it something else? Maybe they sensed it immediately, that instinctual feeling that something was wrong. Maybe the way he spoke, the way he looked at them, set off alarms they tried to ignore. But it was already too late. That night, as darkness swallowed the trail, Robert and Susan set up camp, unaware that death was only a few steps away. Randall Lee Smith was already watching, already planning. And in the dead of night, he made his move. The Appalachian Trail is vast, so deep and isolated that a scream at night might never be heard. And on that night, as the wind rustled through the trees and the only light came from the stars above, something horrific took place inside Robert and Susan's tent. When investigators arrived, they were met with a scene so violent that even the most hardened among them struggled to process what they were looking at. The tent, once a place of shelter, had been turned into a slaughterhouse. Blood soaked through the fabric, pooling into the dirt beneath. The bodies of Robert Mountford and Susan Ramsey lay inside, their young lives stolen in the most savage way imaginable. They had been stabbed over and over again. The attack was frenzied, driven by something far beyond mere robbery or random violence. This wasn't the work of someone desperate for food or money. This was personal. The weapon used was never found, but the sheer brutality of the wounds suggested a deep, uncontrollable rage. Some of the strikes had been so forceful that they pierced through sleeping bags. It was clear the attack happened while they were vulnerable, resting, believing they were safe in the wilderness. The strangest part, there was no obvious sign of a struggle outside the tent. No footprints suggesting a chase. No broken branches or trampled brush. It was as if the killer had moved in silence, striking fast and without hesitation. Whoever had done this hadn't needed to subdue them. He had gone straight for the kill. The discovery sent shockwaves through the hiking community. The Appalachian Trail was supposed to be a place of peace, a sanctuary, but now fear spread through the trees like wildfire. Hikers packed up and left. The ones who stayed began carrying knives, sleeping in shifts, and keeping a close eye on anyone who looked unfamiliar. A killer was loose in the woods, and no one knew where he would strike next. Finding a murderer in the Appalachian wilderness was like looking for a ghost. The trail stretched for thousands of miles, winding through thick forests, towering mountains, and isolated valleys. If the killer had vanished into the trees, he could be anywhere. Authorities scrambled to assemble a search team. Bloodhounds were brought in, their noses pressed to the ground, picking up the scent of something sinister. Helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights cutting through the endless green. Rangers scoured campsites, questioning hikers, looking for anyone who seemed suspicious. But the forest is a perfect hiding place. The deeper you go, the quieter the world becomes. A person could disappear out here and never be found. Days passed, leads ran dry, and fear began to settle into the bones of the investigators. Had they lost him? Was he still out there, watching from the shadows? Or worse, was he preparing to kill again? For days, the Appalachian Trail was gripped by terror. Hikers abandoned their routes, rangers patrolled the forests, and investigators pushed forward, desperate to find the person responsible for the brutal murders of Robert Mountford and Susan Ramsey. Then, a breakthrough. Not far from the crime scene, in the dense Virginia wilderness, authorities caught a man alone, disheveled, and carrying a backpack filled with unsettling evidence. His name was Randall Lee Smith. Inside his bag, investigators found personal items that had belonged to Robert and Susan. A map, a notebook, small belongings that had once been in their possession. But the most damning piece of evidence, bloodstains on his clothes, on his gear. It wasn't enough to prove he had killed them, but it was enough to make him the prime suspect. Smith was arrested and charged with their murders. His name sent a shiver through the local community. He wasn't a well-known criminal, just another drifter who had blended into the background. someone who might have walked past other hikers unnoticed before choosing his victims. But the more investigators tried to build a case against him, the more uneasy they became. There were no witnesses. No one had seen the attack take place. And even with the stolen belongings, there was no smoking gun, no murder weapon, no clear motive, nothing that could definitively place him inside that tent on the night of the killings. The case against Randall Lee Smith was built on circumstantial evidence, and it wasn't enough. Randall Lee Smith should have been facing a trial for double murder. A case like this, two young hikers viciously stabbed to death, should have led to a courtroom battle that would bring justice to their families. But that never happened. Instead, something unexpected took place. Rather than a full trial, Smith struck a deal. He pleaded guilty not to murder, but to 2 counts of second-degree murder, a lesser charge. And the punishment? He was sentenced to 30 years in prison, but there was a catch: he wouldn't serve all of it. With parole, Randall Lee Smith could be released in just over a decade. It was an outcome that made no sense. Why would prosecutors with 2 brutal murders on their hands accept a plea bargain? Did they doubt their case? Were they afraid that if it went to trial, a jury might not convict him? Or was there something more sinister at play? To this day, the full details behind Smith's plea deal remain murky, but one thing is clear: he got out. And when he did, he went right back to the woods, right back to where it all began. For the families of Robert Mountford and Susan Ramsey, justice never truly came. Randall Lee Smith had butchered 2 innocent hikers in their sleep, had left their bodies to be discovered in a scene so brutal it haunted investigators for years. Yet, instead of spending his life behind bars, he walked free. After serving just over a decade in prison, Smith was quietly released. No fanfare, no headlines, no public outrage. One day, he was simply out. For those who had followed the case, the short sentence felt like a betrayal. How could a man who had committed such unspeakable acts be allowed to walk among the living again? The Appalachian Trail community had not forgotten. Hikers who had once felt safe now looked over their shoulders, wondering if the trail would ever be the same. Authorities had little to say about his release. He had served his time, they claimed. There was nothing more to be done. And for a while, it seemed like he had disappeared. No one knew where he had gone, what he had been doing, or if he had changed. But he hadn't, because Randall Lee Smith had no intention of starting a new life. He had unfinished business. Most criminals, once released, try to keep a low profile. They move to a different city, change their name, attempt to blend into society. Not Randall Lee Smith. He went back to the Appalachian Trail, back to the place where he had spilled blood. The question was why? Was it nostalgia? A twisted longing for the place where he had committed the most violent act of his life? Or was it something darker? Had he returned to kill again? For years, hikers whispered about his presence. There were stories, unconfirmed sightings of a man resembling Smith wandering the woods, watching from a distance, lurking near the very same campsites where Robert and Susan had taken their final breaths. No one knew what he was planning. No one knew what he was waiting for. Until 27 years later, when the nightmare happened again. The Appalachian Trail had long moved on from the horrors of 1981. New hikers walked its paths, unaware of the blood that had once stained its soil. Randall Lee Smith's crimes had faded into legend, one of those stories that veteran hikers told around campfires, a cautionary tale of the dangers lurking in the wilderness. But Smith wasn't a ghost of the past. He was very much alive, and he was about to strike again. It was now 2008, a quiet evening in the Virginia backwoods. 2 fishermen, Sean Farmer and Scott Johnston, had set up camp along the water, enjoying the solitude that only nature could provide. They had no reason to fear anything, no reason to suspect that someone with a history soaked in blood was watching them from the trees. As the sun dipped behind the hills, a stranger approached. A thin, older man, disheveled and quiet. He introduced himself as Ricky Williams and claimed his car had broken down nearby. He asked if he could sit with them for a while, share a meal, maybe warm up by the fire. Sean and Scott were friendly men, the kind of people who didn't turn away a stranger in need. They welcomed him, offered him food, and spent the evening making small talk. But something was off. The way he spoke slow, measured, like he was searching for the right words. The way he watched them not with gratitude, but with something else, something harder to place. Scott would later recall the eerie feeling that crept over him, that gut instinct screaming that something wasn't right. But by the time they realized who they had let into their campfire, it was too late. Because Ricky Williams wasn't some lost traveler. He was Randall Lee Smith, and he had come there to kill. It happened fast. One moment they were talking. The next, Smith pulled out a gun and opened fire. Scott Johnston took the first bullet, a sudden burst of pain as the round tore through his body. He staggered, blood pouring down his chest, as Smith turned the gun on Sean. The second shot rang out. Sean was hit, collapsing to the ground. The night air, once filled with the crackling of the fire and the hum of the river, was now thick with gun smoke and the sound of ragged breathing. But Smith had made a mistake. They weren't dead. Despite the bullet wounds, both men were still alive, and in that moment their survival instincts kicked in. Scott, wounded but determined, forced himself to move. He saw Smith stepping forward, likely preparing to finish them off, and knew they had only seconds to act. Bleeding, disoriented, they made a run for it. Their bodies screamed in pain, but they didn't stop. They ran into the darkness, into the trees, desperate to get away. They didn't know if Smith was chasing them. They didn't know if they'd make it. All they knew was that if they stopped running, they were dead. Blood dripped onto the forest floor as Scott Johnston and Sean Farmer stumbled through the darkness. Every step sent waves of pain through their bodies, but stopping meant death. Behind them, Randall Lee Smith was still there, the man who had sat by their fire just moments ago, now transformed into a relentless predator. Scott's vision blurred as he pressed a shaking hand against his wound. The bullet had torn through him, but adrenaline kept him upright. He couldn't think about the pain. He couldn't think about the man who had tried to murder them. All that mattered was getting away. Sean, equally wounded, fought against the shock taking over his body. The forest was vast, swallowing them in its eerie silence. The only sound was their ragged breathing and the rustling of leaves beneath their feet. Smith didn't chase them, not yet. Maybe he thought they wouldn't get far. Maybe he assumed they'd collapse from blood loss, making them easy targets. But he underestimated them. Through sheer willpower, Scott and Sean pushed forward, their bodies barely holding together. And then headlights. A flicker of hope in the distance. A road, a car, salvation. With the last of their strength, they burst onto the road, waving their arms, desperate for help. The driver, a passing stranger, saw two blood-soaked men emerging from the woods and slammed on the brakes. Seconds later, the fishermen were rushed to safety. They had survived. But the nightmare wasn't over yet, because Randall Lee Smith wasn't done. Smith knew he had to act fast. His victims had escaped, and any second now, police would be on their way. His time in the woods had run out. So he did what any desperate man would do. He stole their truck. With blood still on his hands, Smith climbed into the fisherman's vehicle, turned the key, and sped off into the night. His plan was simple: vanish into the mountains. The same wilderness that had once protected him would shield him again. He could disappear. He had done it before. But fate had other plans. Speeding down the backroads of Virginia, Smith lost control of the truck. The tires skidded, the vehicle lurched, and before he could react, he crashed. The truck slammed into a tree, metal twisting, glass shattering. Smith was alive, but barely. The same forest that had been his hunting ground had now become his prison. He lay there, broken, unable to move. By the time authorities arrived, the story had come full circle. Randall Lee Smith, the man who had once stalked the Appalachian Trail, who had killed two innocent hikers in their sleep, who had walked free after serving a fraction of his sentence, was now the hunted. And this time, there would be no escape. Randall Lee Smith had spent his life lurking in the shadows, preying on those who never saw him coming. He had gotten away with murder twice. He had walked free after taking the lives of two young hikers, and now, nearly 3 decades later, he had returned to the same hunting grounds, armed and ready to kill again. But this time, the wilderness turned against him. The moment he lost control of the stolen truck, it was as if fate itself had intervened. The vehicle skidded violently off the road, tires screeching, metal twisting. Smith had no time to react. The truck careened into a tree with an earth-shattering impact. Glass exploded. The steering column crushed inward. The man who had once prowled the forest like a ghost was now trapped, bleeding, his body shattered by the very escape plan he had counted on. For years, Smith had evaded justice. But here, in the darkness of the Appalachian backroads, it had finally caught up with him. The man who had spent his life taking lives was now helpless, waiting for death to claim his own. When authorities arrived, they found the wreckage still smoldering. Inside the twisted remains of the truck, Randall Lee Smith was barely clinging to life. His breaths were ragged, his body broken. But he wasn't dead. Not yet. Paramedics worked quickly, pulling him from the wreck and rushing him to the nearest hospital. There would be no trial this time, no plea deals, no early release. But there would also be no justice. Because before the law could catch up with him, before he could be held accountable for his crimes, Randall Lee Smith died from his injuries. Just like that, it was over. No final words, no confession, no explanation for why he had returned to kill again. He had spent his last days exactly where he had begun, deep in the Appalachian wilderness, searching for his next victim. But in the end, he became the hunted. For some, his death felt like closure, a fitting end to a man who had caused so much pain. But for others, it felt like an escape. He had never answered for what he had done. He had never faced the families of Robert Mountford and Susan Ramsey. He had left behind only questions that would never be answered. And the most chilling one of all, was Randall Lee Smith really the only predator lurking on the Appalachian Trail? The Appalachian Trail stretches for over 2,000 miles, winding through forests, mountains, and isolated valleys. It is a place of beauty, adventure, and discovery. But it is also a place of disappearance, of violence, of secrets buried deep beneath the soil. Randall Lee Smith is dead, but the fear he instilled remains. To this day, veteran hikers still tell his story. They speak of the murders, the brutal night when Robert and Susan's lives were stolen in their tent. They whisper about his release, how a killer was set free, allowed to roam the world again. And they warn newcomers about his return to the woods, his final failed attempt to kill. But as terrifying as his crimes were, he is not the only one. How many other hikers have vanished without a trace? How many more killers walk the same trails, hidden beneath the trees, waiting for their chance to strike. The Appalachian Trail remains one of the most breathtaking places in the world, but for some, it will always be a hunting ground. And the question that lingers in the minds of those who dare to walk its paths is the most chilling of all. Is it still happening? For nearly 30 years, the case of Randall Lee Smith seemed clear-cut. A man lurking in the woods, two hikers brutally murdered, and a quiet plea deal that let him escape the death penalty. But even now, with Smith dead, questions remain. Was he truly the only one responsible for the 1981 murders? Authorities never found the murder weapon. No one had seen Smith commit the crime. His conviction was based on circumstantial evidence, stolen belongings, bloodstains, his strange behavior on the trail. But there were no direct eyewitnesses, no confession, and no forensic proof linking him without a doubt to the murders. Some have speculated that Smith may not have acted alone. Others wonder if he was even the true killer at all. Could someone else have been responsible, using him as a scapegoat? Or had he simply been caught with the victim's belongings after the fact? The truth will never be known. And then there's the most chilling question of all. If he hadn't been released, would the attack in 2008 have ever happened? His early release allowed him to return to the trail. It gave him the opportunity to strike again, nearly taking the lives of two innocent fishermen. If not for sheer luck and their desperate fight to survive, he would have added two more bodies to his count. How many other killers have been granted the same second chance? Randall Lee Smith should have been a name in a history book, locked away, forgotten. Instead, his legacy haunts the Appalachian Trail. A convicted murderer released before serving his full sentence. A repeat offender proving that given the chance, he would kill again. His case is a brutal reminder of how justice can fail, of how some killers slip through the cracks, only to resurface years later, more dangerous than before. Hikers still talk about him, especially those who walk the same trails he once stalked. His story is passed down like a ghost story, a warning about the dangers of the wild, not just from nature, but from those who lurk in the shadows. Because Randall Lee Smith was not some ordinary killer. He was patient, he waited, and when the moment was right, he returned to finish what he had started. The Appalachian Trail is a place of beauty, adventure, and freedom, but it is also a place of isolation, a place where a person can disappear without a sound, where a predator can strike and vanish without a trace. Randall Lee Smith is gone, but the trail remains. And the terrifying truth: he was not the first. He will not be the last. There are other hikers who have gone missing, others who never reached their destination, other cases unsolved, unexplained, buried beneath the weight of time. Somewhere right now, another traveler is setting up camp, unaware of what lurks beyond the firelight. Somewhere right now, someone is watching from the darkness. And the only question that remains is, who will be next?